Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I am used to giving public lectures to amateur astronomers. So I'll just pretend you guys are astronomers. You are? Well, excellent. So you're both then. Good. I moved to Sydney in March of this year from 8.5 years, having spent 8.5 years in Beijing at Peking University, and so I'm enjoying the good air, as you can imagine. Still trying to find people to hang out with. But in the meantime, I gave this talk to the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Macquarie University, where I'm based now, because I've written a book. This is the book, Time and Time Again, Determination of Longitude at Sea in the 17th Century. It's a project that just started at some point. I was following some lines of research. I was based in China. I was interested in some events that happened in the sky in the 17th century that hadn't been seen by anyone in Europe, so I figured in China they might have seen it because they were very good astronomers and they kept records, right? Now, I couldn't read the ancient Chinese records, so one of my colleagues looked into that, and I continued looking into records, letters, whatever, from the 17th century online. I came across a database of about 20,000 scholarly letters from the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, that part of the world, from the 17th century, mostly focused, centered on Christian Huygens, the famous scientist, student, I think you might call them in English, I don't know. Huygens, and I started perusing those letters. And I talked to my friend, the Chinese historian of science, who was interested in helping me pursue my astronomical history idea, and he said, well, maybe you should look into what they did at the time in Europe regarding the determination of longitude at sea. There was a big question. We're doing research about what happened in China at the time, and later this year I will be organizing a conference in Hainan. Hainan is the Hawaii of China, a big island in the south of China. I'm inviting you to give a talk, 20 minutes. I'm paying for your flights, your hotel, and everything, and you get some money for it. Oh, that sounds good. But I have to do the work for it.
In Mandarin?
Well, in English it was an international conference. I had to do the work for it. I had to start actually really browsing through and putting things together. So thanks to that conference, the talk went great. I really enjoyed the community of historians. I wrote a 10-page conference paper, and I thought that was going to be it. And then I ran into a commissioning editor at an astronomy conference who said, do you have an idea for a book? And so 2.5 years later, this was the book. It becomes quite thick. This is it, 368 pages, lots of blood and sweat, no tears. I'm very proud of it, actually. Now, let me get started with a little bit of light entertainment. I found, before I get into the history of the determination of longitude, I found a very nice song by a folk group from the UK that actually addresses the determination of longitude roughly in this time period. Let me start with that song, the first two parts. By show of hands.
Cold blows the wind, colder runs the ocean, colder still the breath of flame glassens the roaring gale. Stars skip their light for duty or devotion, but a sailor's heart needs more than prayer when night and compass fail, and more than hope to steer his lonely sail.
This is the important part.
John Harrison's hands made sure forevermore. Sailors can't find longitude to bring them safe to shore.
When I found out about this song, I was so surprised that something obscure that happened 200 years ago by an obscure Englishman from Yorkshire, a clockmaker, made it into an actual song by a folk group. It's like, oh, this is great, this is fantastic. That's why I wanted to share this with you. Now, you may have heard of the Harrison clocks, H1, H2, H3, H4, that eventually led to John Harrison, a humble clockmaker from northern England, to be awarded roughly half of the British government's Longitude Prize in the late 1700s. That was actually written very well, it was summarized very well in a wonderful popular book called Longitude by Deva Sobel. As you can see, actually Deva wrote my foreword, and I'm very, very pleased that she did that. I met her about a year ago at a meeting in Washington, D.C., and we just, we got off on the right foot, and we had a fantastic discussion, and she agreed to write my foreword. Great. Now, so John Harrison, 18th century. The story I'm going to tell you about today, 17th century, 100 years earlier. Actually, we're starting a bit earlier than that, even 1582. But I'll get to that in just a moment. Today, we're all very familiar with those lines of longitude and latitude on Earth. Latitude, of course, all lines parallel to the equator. Longitude, lines connecting the poles. We've not been able to draw those lines accurately for many centuries, only until 200 years ago, roughly. Only since 200 years ago. Now, latitude is easy to determine. There is a natural zero line, that's the zero line, that's the equator. And what you do is you look at the location of Polaris, the North Star, with respect to your position on Earth. If you are an amateur astronomer, like the gentleman over there, you point your telescope at Polaris and you wait for some time, you can see that all the stars are moving around it because the Earth is rotating on its axis and the axis points at Polaris. And that's why you get that trend.
Southern hemisphere.
We can't see Polaris from here. Yeah, true. Well, just work with it, okay? Yes, well, this story actually started mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. We didn't know anything about the Southern Hemisphere. We're talking 17th century, okay? So what you do is you use an instrument like this, a quadrant. You look at the altitude of Polaris above the horizon is your angle of elevation, is your latitude. The equator is your natural zero point. Okay, that's easy. You've been able to do that forever. The Polynesians could do that already, way before Christ. The Earth goes round in 24 hours. That's 360 degrees in 24 hours. That means every hour corresponds to 15 degrees. So if you had a zero longitude line, and you measured the time difference, let's say at noon local time at zero longitude, with respect to noon local time at your position on Earth, the difference in time that will take gives you the number of degrees on the Earth, right, in longitude. But that was very difficult to do because there is no natural zero point. Here is an overview of 11 of the most common zero longitude lines in use in 1879. There were 11 at that time. They were all going through certain cities. One of them was, of course, the Greenwich Meridian. That's the thick line here. But this was Faro or El Fierro, one of the Canary Islands. Greenwich here, Christiania in Norway. Copenhagen, that's actually Tycho Brahe's zero longitude. Pulkowa, that's an observatory in St. Petersburg. So they were all over the place, mostly based on Europe, but there were zero longitude lines also in India and even as far away as Japan. These 11 zero longitude lines in 1879 were used by 95.5% of ships sailing the seas. The Grijs Meridian was adopted following the International Meridian Conference in 1884, which was organized in Washington, D.C. Since 1884, we have the Greenwich Meridian as zero longitude. If you came to Greenwich Observatory, you will know that there is a line at the observatory on the ground that indicates where, at the time, the zero longitude line was. It no longer is there, by the way. It's about 105 meters to the east. I guess, well, maybe, no. So what happened is, in the old days, they used Greenwich as they had agreed Greenwich was the zero point. Nowadays, they use satellites and a whole range of measuring stations to find the center of the distribution of mass of the Earth. So because of that reason, the zero longitude line has shifted by around 100 meters. Now, today in this particular room, we are here. We know what our longitude and latitude are. How do I know that? Well, it's on your website, but I also have a GPS on my phone. That's easy, but we've only been able to do that fairly recently. Nevertheless, since ancient times, people have put grid patterns on maps. This is a 15th century reproduction of Ptolemy's world map in his Geographia, and you can see that it is distributed here in lines of, well, in squares, in essence, right? Longitude and latitude at the time. This is Europe here, the Arabic Peninsula, etc. This was the world as they knew it around the turn of, well, around 2,000 years ago. This was reproduced in the 15th century. It was not just the Europeans or the Greeks that did this very well. The Islamic scholars did the same thing. Here is a map from the Islamic Golden Age, which occurred between the 8th and 11th centuries. Beautiful map from the 11th century Book of Curiosities, which is currently held by Oxford University. I published it in my book, and I had to pay £80 for it just to get the rights to publish it. They're very expensive in these days. There is a grid on here. You can see the grid here. But the funny thing is, the grid is very fine here, and it becomes much bigger over there. Most likely because the person who drew this didn't quite understand the grid. He did something. By the way, this is a map of the known world, but you might not recognize it. Perhaps you recognize it better this way. It's upside down. Right? This is Europe, North Africa, Arabic Peninsula. That's how they knew the world in the Middle East at that time. In China, roughly around the same time, and this is from 1137, there is a steel engraved grid map known as the UTU, currently located in Xi'an in central China, where they have this army of terracotta warriors. They just distributed or covered this part of the world by a set of squares, and they are 100 leagues on the side, and a league is about a third of a mile or about 500 meters, and that varies a little bit throughout history. So everywhere on Earth, is my point, people try to put things in boxes. They try to put grid patterns on maps to be able to refer to points on, well, within their sphere of influence. Right? Longitude and latitude came much later. First, Europeans since the late 13th century came up with a completely new type of map. And you may have seen this before, where you see all these lines crisscrossed across the oceans. These are not longitude and latitude lines, but these were lines that were given for sailors to go from one coast to another coast, following a certain direction. And these maps are called portolan charts. They have these charts, and they have very accurate, very detailed descriptions of what the coastlines looked like all the way around. So you needed that description and your direction, and then you would end up in the right place. This kind of information was priceless at the time. It was worth more than gold, because this would set you up to do trade all over the place and get to the places you needed to go to. And so if this information fell in the wrong hands, that was a disaster. And most of the time, the sailors who were found by pirates or attacked by pirates would throw that information overboard. I have a quote from roughly that same time by Captain Bartholomew Sharp, reporting on having captured the Santa Rosario of the South American west coast in 1681. He says, "In this prize I took a Spanish manuscript. It describes all the ports, roads, harbors, bays, sands, rocks, and rising of the land, and instructions how to work the ship into any port or harbor. They were going to throw it overboard, but by good luck I saved it, and the Spaniards cried out when I got the book, because this was a disaster, right? Because it was so highly priced. Longitude, or means to determine longitude at sea, started, it took a long time before they could do that, but the first seed of an idea started in 1581 or 1582 by a young guy shown here on the left. Can anyone tell me who this might be? 1581, 1582. The person was about 20 years old or so. No, not that interesting. Galileo, yes, thank you. This is the young Galileo. Galileo must have been bored out of his mind, sitting in the cathedral in Pisa. There's probably some draught going through the rafters, and he looked up and he saw that the chandeliers were swinging back and forth, back and forth. And he timed it using the pulses of his heart. And he found that the chandeliers were swinging very, very regularly. And he said, hey, that might be a means of determining time, or passage of time rather. And so that was 1581, 1582. By 1602 he had become a bit more mature and a bit more interested in following scientific principles, and he wrote a treatise about this, which he discussed with his mentor, Guido Ubaldo da Monte, this guy here, who was originally his patron, but they soon fell out because they heavily disagreed about whether or not these swings were actually regular or not. We call this isochronous, right? Very regular or not. So in essence what Galileo has found out is this here. This is the only equation I'm going to show, where the period of a pendulum, which is in here, but in essence what this is a constant 2 times pi. This is the length of the pendulum, and that's the constant of the gravitational constant. If we take all the constants out, in essence what I get is that the period goes as the square root of L, and what that means is that the period times itself is proportional to the length. So, if you know the length of a pendulum, you know what its period is going to be, right? So how quickly it's going to swing back and forth. All you need to know is the length of the pendulum, not how heavy the bob is, only the length. That was the basis of this whole idea of using pendulums as a clock. So why did Galileo make that jump? For the time, this was a fantastic jump. It was a groundbreaking achievement. Probably because he had learned from his father not to trust authority, but think for himself. And here I have a quote from his father, Galilei Senior. It appears to me that those who rely simply on the weight of authority to prove any assertion without searching out the arguments to support it act absurdly. I wish to question freely and to answer freely without any sort of adulation. That well becomes any who are sincere in the search for truth. This is the scientific method defined by Galilei Senior. Right? Think about it, question things. Don't just believe it because someone tells you to. Galileo himself, the younger, was a member of a circle of friends who were all interested in doing science, and one of his friends was a medic called Santurio, seen on the left here, who probably produced the first accurate timing device in medicine, a pulse meter or pulsiloquium. It's shown here. In essence, this is quite funny. What happened here, you would have a hand here, you would tie a string to your finger, tie it quite tightly, and make the bob at the bottom swing backwards and forwards. And you would tie the string sufficiently tightly to your finger that the pulse of your blood would actually make the bob go like right? And so until it resonated, it was a resonance between the pulse in your finger and that swing period. When that happened, you had your heart rate. Now what that meant is at the time, heart rates were measured in centimeters. But not in so many pulses per second, but in centimeters. That's hence the ruler here, and up there as well. That was the first precision medical instrument designed, probably in the history of medicine, by Galileo's friend Santurio. Galileo himself, of course, very famous for having discovered, this is a letter from 1609, where he tells his patron, the Navy chief, that he discovered that Jupiter has moons and that they go around regularly around the planet. And this planted an idea in his mind that the regularity of the moons going around the planet Jupiter could be used as an astronomical clock. And indeed, it was used. This is from 1668. This was in 1609. Right? This is 1668, and at that time they still had tables in almanacs showing where the individual moons would be at a given time, so you could use it as a timing device. And I started writing my book, being an astronomer. I thought, oh, my book is going to be all about this. Well, it's a little bit about this, but mostly about making clocks. But you'll see that in just a moment. So we needed the time difference, accurate time difference between a kind of a reference meridian, a longitude, and the place on Earth where of which you wanted to know the position. And this was a serious problem in the 1600s. Here is it's from an old letter by some Spanish royalty showing the distance between Toledo in Spain and Rome, measured by different people based on different longitudes, and this is Rome according to different people. So the distance between Toledo and Rome varied depending on who you believe. We didn't have accurate longitude. We didn't have accurate positioning on Earth, because this was going across the Mediterranean, and it was difficult to measure your position where you were. Right? So there was a big problem. We'll get back to that later. This was some different authors taken from a letter of, this was from a Flemish mathematician called Van Langren, who had written this letter to Isabella Clara Eugenia of Spain, wife of Archduke Albert of Austria and daughter of Philip II, King of Spain. Because of issues like this, the King of Spain, but also the government of the Netherlands, or of the Dutch Republic as it was called at the time, issued awards for anyone who could actually solve this intractable longitude problem. And so lots of people tried that, and Van Langren was one of them, but he didn't get the prize. Galileo tried as well. He was not even taken seriously by the Spanish, but he kept going, and he tried to actually use or sell his ideas to the Dutch. And Galileo had a funny idea. He said, at sea we're moving a little bit, but he was hoping to use the regular motions of the moons of Jupiter around the planet as a clock. But at sea you need to be very stable to measure the positions of those moons, because if the ship moves then you lose sight, particularly if you use a telescope. So he had a contraption called a gimbal. There's a moving chair inside of a ring, inside of another ring, which is all oiled, so you would be stable while the ship would go all over the place. That was his idea. And he had a helmet. He designed a helmet called a Senatore, a salad helmet, which in front of one eye had a telescope, so you could actually see the moons, because you can't see them with your naked eye. And with the other eye, you could actually keep track of Jupiter itself, because you can't see it with the naked eye. And he actually had some of the students try this out in the port of Livorno. It didn't work. But he suggested this idea to the Dutch to get the prize that the Dutch government had issued. In response, one of the admirals responded as follows: "My sailors are rude people, men only superficially acquainted with mathematics and astronomy, and who still find insuperable the problem of using your discovery on a moving ship continually being tossed about." So that was the end of that. But didn't work. So Galileo, bright ideas, didn't manage to put it into practice. By 1641, a year before his death, he was blind. But he still had his idea, he still wanted to pursue the idea, and he had the idea to make a pendulum clock. And he described that idea to his son Vincenzo. This is a sketch that Vincenzo made. Galileo died in 1642, this is about a year before his death. Vincenzo tried very hard to put it together. It just simply didn't work. He was not very handy, not very technical, apparently. I have a long quote which I will skip over because I think it's too long to read out, but in essence the quote is saying, well, this is by his biographer from the late 1600s. I was at his place. I saw him dictate to Vincenzo how to build this pendulum clock, but Vincenzo didn't manage to do it. Right, okay. Let's stop that for one moment as we go back. The problem with using pendulum clocks, like this one, right, so here we have all the gear train, and then there's the pendulum, so this is the pendulum that's going backwards and forwards, right? The problem with using the pendulum clock at sea was formidable. And I'll show you a short video to get your mind in the right, thinking about the right things. So and then you tell me why you think this might have been a problem at sea. This is from Master and Commander, a show chronicling 17th century sailors. And you see what happens on a ship, right? Imagine having a pendulum clock on a ship like this. It's going to be being tossed about all over the place, rocking and pitching. And remember, the period of the pendulum, the regularity of its motion depended only on the length, right? On one. But if the ship goes like that, your length changes. If it goes that, like that, your length changes again. So there was no way that using a pendulum, you could actually have a regular clock mechanism. That was the problem. So I'm going to show you how this rocking is about. So Galileo, great ideas, didn't work out. And around that time, the Dutch Republic had just been established. They had been liberated from Spanish occupation, and scientists in the Dutch Republic played a pivotal role in the network of humanists and scholars before and during the scientific revolution which happened at the time. The country was relatively prosperous. It had a global trade network, as it still does today, because we're a small country, and a relative tolerance for new ideas. So lots of people who were persecuted elsewhere in Europe flocked to the Netherlands because they had freedom of expression there. So the Dutch Republic became the storehouse of the intellectual world, and important developments in all kinds of fields found place there. Took place there. At that time, in the Dutch Golden Age, historians at the moment are asking a number of questions. How did knowledge at the time in the 17th century circulate? How did the scientific information system work? How were new elements of knowledge picked up, processed, disseminated, and accepted in the educated community? And until the first scientific journals were published in the 1660s, how did this work? They used letters, but letters were slow and difficult and only one thing. And they also used books, but books took a long time to complete and were harder to distribute and a hassle to produce. I can tell you that from experience. But interestingly enough, despite the fact that books were rare to some extent, scientific journals did not yet exist, and all information was really exchanged through letters. Some people already felt there was too much information in the world. Information overload. Here's a quote from a soldier from 1613. One of the diseases of this age is the multiplicity of books. They got so overcharged the world that it is not able to digest the abundance of idle matter that is every day hatched and brought forth. Information overload. And that actually goes back to antiquity. Seneca said at some point, librorum multitude, the abundance of books is a distraction, and this was around 2,000 years ago. Well, these guys didn't exist today. I mentioned, I'm digressing, but I would like to mention one more thing. This is a letter from, these are minutes of a meeting of the Royal Society of London in 1664, which were very important, these minutes, because the Royal Society of London and the French Académie des Sciences were the first to publish scientific journals. This is the Journal des Savants from the French Académie des Sciences, and this is the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. In these minutes, where some very famous people were present, it says, and I have to actually read it here, that the Philosophical Transactions, they decided to set up this journal, be composed by Mr. Oldenbrook, who was the secretary of the Royal Society. He printed the first Monday of every month. Did he have sufficient matter for it, and that the tract be licensed by the council, being first revised by some of the members of the same. So what this is saying is that anything that was to be published in this journal of the Royal Society should be read by some of the members of the society first before it could be printed. That's what we call peer review. That's what the whole scientific enterprise today is based on. This is the first ever reference to peer review. So this is, for me as a scientist, this is quite cool actually. This is, it came from the archives of the Royal Society, and I knew it existed. It was not available online, so they actually commissioned a photographer to take this, well, the 2 pages that they photographed for me, and so this is also in the book. Anyway, I digressed. I would like to go back to the clock's accurate timekeeping, and an important gentleman who got into the field in the mid-1600s was Christian Huygens. Christian Huygens here, as a young man, he This is a short video showing you some of his clocks. This is a bust. Some of his clocks survived. You can see the mechanism here. He was quite an innovator. He made these things which are called chops, which allowed the pendulum to be really isochronous, really regular, no matter how far it would swing out from the vertical. And he had a very clever idea to put lots of little pulleys together, and this became known as the endless chain that allowed you to rewind the clock without having to stop it. So that was a nice innovation as well. This is actually from, this is animation of course, but this is from one of his publications in 1657 called the Horologium, the clock in essence. Clocks made up of this gear train, lots of little gears, and what it was all about at the time is constructing a pendulum clock that had a period of 1 second back and forth, exactly 1 second. So that's just a very brief introduction to Huygens. I'll get back to how that works in a little bit more detail later. Now Huygens published his description of the first pendulum clock that actually worked. He wrote about it in January 1657, saying that over Christmas the previous year, 1656, he had put this contraption together. He wrote to Van Schoten. Van Schoten was his mentor at Leiden University, and he said, "One of these days I invented a new type of construction for a timepiece which can be used to measure time so accurately that there is more than a little hope that this can be used to determine the longitude, at least as regards travel on the seas." And this was done in December 1656. News spread very rapidly across Europe. A French mathematician, a member of the Académie Parisien, the Parisian Academy, Claude Milon, wrote to Huygens, "Your invention of a timepiece is thought of very highly by all with whom I have discussed it. It will be even better if you can make sure that it is not affected by changes to either counterweight or spring. With such a watch you can derive a true equation of time as required to determine the longitude." So longitude was really on the minds of people at that time. I've highlighted the equation of time here because I need to explain what that means. If we use a regular clock, 24 hours, right, that's a full day. At noon clock time, depending on the time of the year, the sun may be at the zenith, or maybe just before the zenith, or just after the zenith, because the Earth is tilted, right? And so, in essence, what that is, depending on in winter and in summer, the conventional clock time and the solar time differ through this figure of 8. This figure of 8 is called an analemma. And so the equation of time corrects for that effect, really. So Huygens was smart enough to already take that into account. He published lots of drawings. He published a very, very important treatise in 1658 called Horologium, the clock. And in 1673 he published Horologium Oscillatorium, the pendulum clock, which was really one of the most advanced pieces of applied mathematics ever written by a single person. So it was quite amazing. I won't go into great detail, but some of the innovations he introduced were this is the pendulum, with these chops to make sure that the clock was as regular as it gets, because if it's just going without correction, it's not quite a... When you get large swings, you lose this regularity. He introduced this gear train, which is his endless chain, which allowed him to rewind the clock without having to stop it. So all kinds of new things. And he introduced what's called a verge escapement, shown here. And this is how the clock goes around. Right? So this wheel drives one of the levers forward, and the other lever on this side stops the wheel from spinning out of control. Because otherwise, if you put a weight at the bottom of your clock, and you wouldn't have something like this, it would just pull it out in one go. So that was an invention that Huygens contributed to, or improved significantly as well. So he made the first pendulum clock, 1656, and he improved it a little bit since. But there was money to be made, of course, based on pendulum clocks. So in 1656, 1657, he got a number of patents from the national government and from the provincial government. But at the same time, there was a competitor. Huygens was based in The Hague. There was a competitor from Rotterdam who also got a patent for something slightly different. And Huygens said, "You've stolen this from me. You've gone to the church of Scheveningen, which is a small seaside village outside of The Hague, and you've looked inside the mechanism and you've stolen this idea from me." And Huygens called the guy, his name was Simon Dow, shameless and criminal, and a stupid and shameless man. Huygens did not mince words. And this comes back over and over again in history. He was not a nice guy to deal with. He didn't suffer fools at all, and he was quite harsh in his judgments of others. Nevertheless, Huygens tried to access the markets in France and in Italy, but he was unsuccessful. The French did not want to alienate the French clockmakers, and the Italians said, "You've stolen this idea from Galileo." That was called plagiarism at the time, but it's different from what we call plagiarism today. As I said, on the ship, rocking and pitching, pendulums don't really work, so Huygens then came up with the idea of having a spring-driven watch. The spring drive, but the unwinding of the spring drives the motion. At that point, here is just the mechanism of one of the clocks that was made based on his ideas. At that point, Huygens ran into controversy with Robert Hooke in England, because Hooke said, "Oh, but I already invented this many years ago." But Hooke kept his secret very tight to his chest, and so he actually didn't publish it. If you don't publish it, you did not invent it, right? That's the way it works. And so lots of controversy came from this. Here, just to give you an idea of how mechanical watches work, what's most important in watches, there are 5 elements. There's the energy provided by the spring, in this case. Coming up here in a moment. The spring is sitting inside of the piston here. That's the energy. Then the gear train, the escapement, which I just showed, and I'll show you another example, and then the controller that controls the hands of the clock. Another innovation that Huygens came up with was a conical clock, where you see what happens here. It's suspended from up there, and it goes around this ball, so it goes in a circle rather than backwards and forwards. It goes in a circle. The conical clock. Lots of his ideas here, how this might have worked. Again, he introduced something to change the path of that pendulum. This is again one of those chops. The shape is called a cycloid, and the cycloid is the curve that you get if you roll a ball and you do it like this, you see there this movement at the bottom. His conical clock actually worked. This is a clock made based on the sketches of Huygens, and you can see that the pendulum goes round and round and round, and it actually works, and it is stable. I think it's quite cool that it works. Another innovation that he worked on was the anchor escapement. And again, so I mentioned the verge escapement earlier, where that was there to prevent the clock from the weights from falling down in one go. This is a slightly different type of escapement, which worked better because there was no recoil. So it would be more stable and more regular. Anyway, so Huygens did a lot of work, and there was a lot of controversy as well, he fought with many people. In the next 25 to 30 years, he looked into the effects of humidity, changing temperature, pendulum length, geographical location, counterweight, motion, spring balance, air pressure, all of that. Very importantly, the period of a pendulum clock at temperate latitudes, like in the Dutch Republic at the time, versus at the equator would be different, because the Earth is not entirely round, but it's a bit flattened, and so there is more Earth, more gravity at the equator than at temperate latitudes, and so the geographical location would lead to slight differences in this gravitational constant. Not in the length, but in the gravitational constant, because in the denominator of that equation. He got with lots of ideas. He kept working on it. One of the main things that he did is miniaturize the spring-driven watches. Here's an early sketch from 1675 when he wrote down in Greek, "Eureka." I figured out how to work these spring-driven timekeepers. And here is a sketch of how that spring business timekeeper might work. This is the actual spring here. But then he was still perplexed by the motion of a ship at sea. How do you make that stable? And so he had a number of interesting ideas. You could suspend your boat from two sides. So maybe it's more stable, or even from three. This is a sketch here where you have 1, 2, and 3, and so that would make things very stable. Maybe that seems to work. Here's another one with 2 suspension angles. So we tried to work this. But the point is, everything worked in his rooms in The Hague, but it should be tested, of course, at sea. Huygens only ever went on one sea trial, and that was in 1682, I believe. 1687, September 1687. This is a map of the Netherlands, but it's not in the orientation you're used to. North is to the left, so it's rotated like that. Amsterdam is here. And so what he did is, in 1687, he took 2 clocks on board of a ship, and they were going to sail for a few days on the inland sea here, which was called the Zuiderzee, the Southern Sea. Now it's part of that is actually land, reclaimed land. So here's a ship, and then they got out to sea, but there was a lot of bad weather, inclement weather, and they had to seek refuge in the port of Enkhuizen. So they had to wait for a few days for the weather to clear up, and then they continued to, this is the one of the islands in the north. That's where the Dutch East India Company fleet was moored. This is the island of Texel. So they went all the way out there, and it took them about 7 days to get to. The clocks worked. Even in bad weather, they continued to work. So that was quite an achievement. That was great. Now, to make a long story short, over his career, he published many treatises, instruction manuals, etc., etc. Here's a few of them. And so the Dutch East India Company, the DOC, agreed to let him bring 2 clocks on board of a voyage from Texel in the north of the Netherlands to the Cape of Good Hope, a long distance sea trial. So here's the Dutch East India fleet ready to depart. The first voyage, he actually did 2 voyages, as I'll tell you in a moment, started on the 24th of March 1686, and they returned on the 15th of August 1687, a year and a half later. They went from the north here, up the Netherlands, around the British Isles, all the way down to Cape Town, but on that outbound journey, there were problems. The clocks didn't work properly, some things broke, and they did not take any measurements. So they arrived at in Cape of Good Hope, at Table Mountain there. The guy who had been sent on board was quite ill, but he recovered, and so he took the next ship back, in essence. And then they took some measurements. Now, the raw measurements would give you this line here. And you see that this line goes straight through Ireland and Scotland. They didn't sail through Ireland and Scotland. The ship's mariners had kept track of where they thought they were, using standard methods of determining where they were, and they thought they had sailed along this line, the leftmost of these lines. After correcting the raw measurements for some inaccuracies and for using some astronomical benchmarks, the corrected route was the one that's actually very close to the mariner's route. I think this was cheating a bit, because they corrected the raw measurements by saying, oh, this is wrong, we should actually have been a little bit further to the west. And they knew that it was unfair, they restricted it. So I think that's cheating. These days, in the scientific literature, you wouldn't get away with that. But they did at the time. Although, von Schoten, Huygens' former mentor, disagreed that the measurements were so good, and he said we need more trials to work out whether the clocks are really as good as Huygens actually said. So we need to move there. So how accurate did it need to be? This is the status by the end of the 17th century. The resolutions from Dutch East India Company were originally that the clocks had to be better than 1 second deviation for 24 hours. That is very difficult to get. And that was actually made slightly less strict in practice better than 2 seconds per 24 hours, which is still very high. Now, it turns out from the first sea trial, they got 10 minutes, 51 seconds deviation in 6 days. In essence, that meant a 2.5 degree deviation of the island of Tenerife. That's too much for longitude determination. So finally, this is already late in his life, Huygens conceded, he was very stubborn and very proud, he conceded that, yeah, maybe we have made some mistakes and we need correction. That was the first time that I've encountered that Huygens actually conceded that he wasn't right. I told you he was a difficult man. And so he suggested we should do this again. They did a second journey that wasn't, unfortunately, was not good enough either. Huygens died on the 8th of July 1695 before being able to issue his clock. So he's done a lot of things. He's come up with lots of inventions and innovations to make his clocks work better, and all of that contributed to much better clocks, but he still hadn't made the perfect marine balance, as he called it. Now, we're then turning to we're turning into the 18th century. And I mentioned at the very beginning the book by Eva Sobel, Longitude. Her story starts more or less in 1714 with the British Longitude Act. Let me show you a brief video that gives an introduction to what happened in the early part of the 18th century.
On a damp October day in 1707, a fleet of British warships was returning home from battle with the French. They were just a day's sail from England. Although they had no way of determining their exact position, they believed they were safely clear of the treacherous Scilly Islands off the English coast. But as the ship sailed on, a crash was heard on the lower decks of the flagship. They had run aground, and the hull had been severed below the waterline. One by one, 4 ships hit the rocks, and one by one, they sank. In a matter of minutes, thousands of men drowned, and an important part of England's fleet was lost. The wreck of Admiral Shovel's fleet was a national tragedy. There were days of mourning, official inquiries. If England was to be master of the seas, how could such a disaster have happened in her home waters? An official of the Royal Navy, Samuel Pepys, had expressed the nation's alarm.
It is most plain from the confusion all these people are to be, that it is by God's almighty providence and the wideness of the sea that there are not a great many more misfortunes in navigation than there are.
The unfortunate situation had been exposed, and an outcry finally forced some action. In 1714, Parliament offered a reward to anyone who could solve the key problem of navigation: how to find longitude at sea. The prize was big enough to capture the attention of the nation. £20,000, equivalent to millions today. Proving voyages to the West Indies would be required to test the method, and a distinguished board would pass judgment.
Right, now, this is an excerpt of a video that I actually found on YouTube. This is about Eva Sobel's book, and I recommend if you're interested, just look for it on YouTube. It's often said that this disaster at the Scilly Isles led to the enactment of the Longitude Act. That's actually incorrect. It was used as the disaster was used as an argument to convince politicians that had we known longitude better, this might have been prevented, but it was not the actual cause. I did some research, and all the details are in the book, and I can provide you with the URL, the website where you can download a PDF copy at the end. In view of the time, let me actually skip the next few slides, but there were many other ideas by people who tried to work out different ways of determining positions at sea. An interesting one here was by Edmund Halley. You may have heard of Halley. Halley was one of the Astronomer Royals, the most senior astronomers in England. And he said, well, maybe we can just look at the direction of magnetic field lines on Earth. And he went on some expeditions to work out how magnetic field lines ran across the surface of the Earth. This is his map. This is called, it's a map of isogones from 1701. But unfortunately, it was too uncertain to measure the direction of the magnetic field, so this was not a viable means of determining longitude either. Then there were some very interesting ideas, and I have another short video I'd like to share with you.
But some way of keeping the time at sea had to be found. Desperate problems invite desperate solutions. One fantastic scheme was presented by Professors William Whiston and Humphrey Ditton.
All that would be needed is a straight row of 20 or 30 warships, somehow permanently anchored across the Atlantic. At midnight each night, the ships would fire off large sky rockets, which could be seen or heard for 100 miles around. With the explosions, mariners will always know when it is midnight in Greenwich, and will be able to determine their longitude by comparing Greenwich time to the local time on board their ship.
Now, that didn't work, clearly. There's a lot of problems with it. We can discuss it later. But one of the ideas, they had no idea how deep the Atlantic Ocean was. Plus, imagine being based on one of those ships having to shoot those flares up at midnight. That would have been such a boring job, right? Anyway, so that was an interesting idea. However, Whiston and Ditton, those two guys, had some experience because they had done experiments. This is a map of London, Shooter's Hill. By shooting cannons at Shooter's Hill, whether or not you could hear that at a certain distance. So they had done some of their homework. So it was not completely outrageous. But the point I wanted to make here is that upon the announcement of this huge prize for a solution to the longitude problem, lots of people proposed projects. They were called projectors. And many of them were completely wacky and out of this world, really strange. And that actually led to this famous painting that some of you may have seen. This is William Hogarth, Bedlam's Asylum from Rake's Progress. And here this poor soul in the background is contemplating longitude and latitude on the wall. Background, there's all kinds of people in the mental asylum. This is an interesting piece. The final thing I want to share with you before I stop. Another weird idea was referred to as the wounded dog theory. And if you've read David's book, you probably are familiar with it. In essence, and this is an allegory from a drawing from the science that I found somewhere in a German document. The Germans only charge €7.50 to publish this, by the way, not in Paris. But anyway, the idea was based on something called a powder of sympathy. There was like an alchemical idea like 100 years earlier, which were called salves of sympathy, that in essence what that meant is that if you were wounded by by a dagger or whatever, you would put those salves on the dagger and that would magically cure your wound. Now, that was alchemy. They didn't want to be associated with that, but there was an Englishman called Sir Kenelm Digby who said, well, instead of salves of sympathy, we can use a powder of sympathy. And so what we should do is, for instance, that a ship that was leaving port in London would take on board with it a dog, but before setting off, we just stick a sword in the dog. So we wound the dog, right? There is blood on that sword. We leave that on the sword, and the ship sails away. And every day at noon London time, we dip the sword in this powder of sympathy to help the wound heal at a distance, of course. And that was not by any means a nice way of healing the wound. It was very painful, so the dog would start yelping. So that meant that the captain at the ship, wherever they were at sea, would know when it was 12 noon in London. That was the wounded dog theory. Now, whether or not this was entirely serious? We don't know. It could have just been, pardon?
How many dogs died?
We don't think that this ever happened, but this was probably a bit satire. But anyway, all these funny and strange ideas came up. If you're interested, I invite you to maybe download a copy of my book. I'll give you the website in just a moment, because it's full of anecdotes. There's a little bit of technical detail here and there. You can just skip over it, but it's mostly based on quotes from letters from that period, and some of them are absolutely amazing to read. So hopefully I've given you here a bit of an overview of how this whole development of longitude determination at sea happened. Of course, by the time that I finished my book, 1714 roughly, well, I didn't finish it, but the timeline is finished in 1714, didn't have a solution yet. The solution would require another 60 years or so, until the 1770s, when John Harrison finally got roughly half of the longitude prize, and the solution was found in metallurgy. To make things stable, you needed to have springs made of bimetals, different metals that would not be subject to temperature changes, humidity changes, etc., etc. But that's very well described in Dave Sobel's book, so I won't actually go into too much detail. I'd like to stop here. Thank you for your attention, and that's the URL if you're interested in downloading a copy. Thank you. Now, Richard, are you happy to take a few questions? Absolutely. Go on.
You mentioned there about the pendulum, if it swings too far, there's some error that creeps in, and hence it has those brackets to minimise that. Where does that error come from?
Circular swings are not entirely regular. In essence, if you have a circular swing, if the deviation from the vertical is greater, then you start to get deviations from regular swings. That's simply mathematics, actually. And so you needed to have a path of the bulb that was not a circle, but more like a parabola. In order to get that, you needed those chops to change the shape of the string a little bit.
It's actually moving the pivot point here.
Yeah, it is. And so this was the shape of those chops is called cycloids. And so this was a completely new field of applied mathematics that I was just invented using geometry. They did not have calculus at the time. This is amazing.
I can see it now, it's very clever.
No, the pivot point was the same, but by having those chops there, in essence what I would do is artificially change the pivot point. Any other questions? Question here?
Who thought of dividing the day into 24 hours and 60 minutes an hour?
Now, that is a question I don't have an answer to. I do know that early clocks did not have seconds. They only had minutes and hours. I have no idea who actually came up with the idea of using 24 hours. Any further questions?
You have internet access, right?
Do I have what?
You have internet access at the moment.
Not right now, no.
Okay. I was going to get you to show the Harvard pendulum.
Right, okay.
Seen the Harvard pendulum? This is all amazing. Last night I was at my astronomy club, and we had a philosopher there talking about philosophy and astronomy, and where crossovers are. And he shows a demonstration of the Harvard pendulum.
I'll check it out when I get home.
It's a series of 15 balls on strings at different heights, and you start the swing together, and the length of the pendulums are set up so that the longest one does 51 oscillations in a minute, and the next one's 52, and so on up to 53 oscillations. And when you look along the pendulum, like along the axis of them, the patterns that they make, they come in and out of harmonic resonance, and in exactly 1 minute they're all back exactly together. So from that last night,
the Harvard pendulum, okay.
I looked up how the Harvard pendulum works. Then I got my plumb bob and started swinging it to find out And then I went on the internet and found those formulas you showed.
Yeah.
And now I've written the computer program for the first pendulum.
There you go.
Any further questions?
Can you buy your bound book?
Can I do what?
Are the bound copies available?
You can buy them from Amazon.
Amazon?
Yeah, not from IOP. This was published by the Institute of Physics, but they actually don't sell them directly to the public. They sell them to libraries.
Right.
It's expensive. That's why I put it on here.
Yeah, no,
it's 150 US.
But there's nothing like a book.
Yeah, so it's expensive.
Well, I think on that happy note, we'll call the questions finished, and you can ask Richard a bit later on after we finish. I'd like to give you those.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So you enjoy it.
Good.